Welcome to America and the Pacific, 1899 to 1942. This class will be considering American activities and imperialism in the Pacific, starting with the Spanish-American War in 1898 and the subsequent annexation of the Philippines, and the Philippine-American War of 1899 to 1902. We'll then explore American diplomacy and economic activities and imperialism generally in the region throughout the first half of the 20th century leading up to World War II. The Philippine-American War, in particular, is worth considering as one of America's most imperialistic endeavors outside of North America. It not only served as an attempt to spread American influence into this new to America region, but to show that America was an imperialist power on par with European powers that were also very concerned in this era with ruling colonies and possessions in East Asia. Prior to these conflicts, American activities in the Pacific were largely limited to the West Coast, including the 1867 purchasing of Alaska from Russia. But interest in the region had been growing throughout the latter 19th century, particularly in terms of controlling Hawaii. In fact, the annexation of Hawaii took place during the Spanish-American War, in part due to the strength that the expansionist lobby gained during that conflict. In the aftermath of the war, through the Treaty of Paris, America took possession of both the Philippines and Guam, which along with Hawaii formed a chain that stretched across the Pacific. It was a strong statement that America was going to be involved in that region. There are a lot of details we can go into in this discussion, and we'll get to some of them in later lectures. But for today, I want to focus on four major influences or ideas that factored very significantly into American activities in the region, into the annexation of the Philippines, interactions with China and Japan, and just American imperialism in the region generally. These are not necessarily causes of the Philippine-American War, though that will be a major focus of this lecture, but they are ideas that, when applied more generally and tracked through the decades of the first half of the 20th century, can help us understand American activities in that region. First up is kind of a generic idea, but it's that of international competition. It might seem a little bit strange from our perspective to frame a war and the seizure of an island in the context of a competition, but it was not uncommon for large nations in this era to see imperial activities in that sort of context. For example, the struggle between Great Britain and Russia over Afghanistan was often called the Great Game. And a similar sort of dynamic was in place in East Asia during the 19th century as imperial powers sought to take naval bases and establish presence in China and neighboring territories. Germany came late to this movement and was trying to catch up with other European powers in both Africa and Asia. They had just acquired a port in China as an imperial possession, but they were eager for more acquisitions. After U.S. Commodore Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet in Manila Harbor during the Spanish-American War, Germany sent their Pacific Squadron of warships to the Philippines, not to fight American forces, but in the hopes that if America withdrew and didn't stay in the islands, that they might be able to move into a power vacuum and take a new possession. Although the German presence didn't cause America to annex the islands, there was certainly a feeling among both American diplomats and military personnel that having defeated the Spanish in the Philippines, it would be a weak move to allow another nation to move in and assume control of those islands. Especially after they showed strength in defeating a European power, American imperialists really wanted to flex their muscles by holding on to some of those Spanish possessions. It was seen as an effective way to build off of the momentum of the war and build national prestige. Furthermore, as we consider American control of the islands through the subsequent decades, there was a strong desire to show that America could not only engage in imperialism, but that they could do it better than the Europeans. This impulse is connected to the benevolent assimilation idea that McKinley proposed to justify annexing the Philippines. It was the idea that the U.S., rather than exploiting the Philippines, rather than abusing the people and extracting resources from them, was going to be there benevolently to improve life in the Philippines, to elevate the primitive culture of the Filipino people, as McKinley might have referred to them, and to teach them how to be civilized. From a modern perspective, there are significant problems with that type of mindset, and we'll get into that later in the course, but for now we're establishing what some of the motivations and justifications were. And this idea of showing that America was on par with other major nations was a significant factor. A second related motivation was that of national and military strategy. Much of late 19th century military policy was influenced by the ideas of Alfred Mahan, whose influential work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and its sequel, established ideas of the importance of sea power to maintaining national power and supremacy. Wrapped into that was the need to have outposts or colonies from which military power could be projected by sea. There's a lot more nuance to his theories than that, but as Mahan isn't really the focus of this course, that'll be enough to start with. Theodore Roosevelt was a personal acquaintance of Mahan and purportedly helped develop some of his theories. Roosevelt was a particularly strong proponent of America acquiring foreign possessions, specifically with this goal of projecting and expanding military power. That's why, although the U.S. did not assume control of Cuba after the war, they did establish a naval base at Guantanamo Bay to serve as a facility from which power could be projected into the mid-Atlantic and Caribbean. Similarly, adding Guam and the Philippines would form a chain of military bases and coaling stations to supply the American Navy across the Pacific. As the example of Guantanamo Bay in Cuba shows, it might have been possible to establish a treaty with a revolutionary government in the Philippines to allow a U.S. naval base in those islands. But with the islands in a lot of turmoil, that's not an option that appears to have been strongly considered at that time. The resulting Treaty of Paris, from a military perspective, was that it gave America a series of bases across the Pacific that allowed them to be very involved in events in Asia, to have a support system to project power. This had really practical applications almost immediately during the Boxer Rebellion, when the U.S. was able to send some of their occupying forces from the Philippines to intervene in China. That wouldn't have been possible without both having American troops in those islands, but also having that system of support for the American Navy. A third factor that's important in this era is the influence of evangelical religion. President McKinley, who, despite events on the ground not being entirely under his control, made the final decision to officially annex the islands, was a devout evangelical Methodist. Although it's hard to gauge just how influential his religious faith was in this decision, he did reference it on a number of occasions. And there were almost immediately religious overtones in how McKinley talked about the annexation of the Philippines. He proposed the idea of benevolent assimilation, which had its root in missionary ideas of improving life for more primitive peoples while teaching them the gospel. These two things would go hand in hand. Almost immediately, churches and missionary societies prepared to start sending people to the Philippines, at least in part inspired by the fact that the Philippines had been ruled by the Catholic Spanish Empire, though parts of the islands also had a significant Islamic population. Not unlike China in that era, the Philippines was then seen as an ideal place for evangelism. Many of these missionaries also became involved in educational initiatives of the U.S. government by using the Bible to teach English, and others sought to convert the population more directly. This religious emphasis connects strongly with the benevolent assimilation idea. Unlike many European powers, the goal for Americans involved in the annexation was generally not to exploit the islands, but really was to improve them, albeit in a very Western way. This meant teaching English, converting Filipinos to Protestant Christianity, teaching Western methods of farming, developing Western-style infrastructures. It didn't necessarily matter to them if that's what the people of the islands wanted. They saw this as their mission, as America being this stronger nation who could improve life in the Philippine Islands. Finally, economics was a significant factor in the decision to annex the Philippines. This might seem on the surface to be a little bit contradictory to my previous point about not wanting to exploit the Philippines. But that's because this commercial economic idea was not focused on extracting resources from the island. Unlike, say, the British in South Africa, who were there largely for diamonds and gold, there were almost no immediately known resources that could be mined or extracted from the Philippine Islands. Rather, businesses saw the Philippines as a potential new market for their goods, as well as a stepping stone to Chinese markets. As with the benevolent assimilation idea, there was a desire to see the economy of the Philippines put on prosperous grounds so that trade could be extended into the islands. Growing economies mean people that you can sell things to. Resulting complication was that governance of the Philippines got mixed up with tariff debates that were a frequent political topic in the early 20th century. At least some advocates for strong economic ties with the Philippines wanted there to be little to no tariffs, while others worried that the Philippine production of rice and sugar might compete with their own products. Regardless of some of these complexities and debates, which we'll get into in some later weeks, there was still a strong business-driven desire to see the Philippines brought into the economic sphere of the United States and to be a part of the broader American economy. Annexing the islands would, at least in theory, make that connection stronger and quicker than it otherwise might have been, and would make America a bigger economic force in the Pacific region in general. So these are 4 ideas I want you to keep in mind throughout this course as we consider both the genesis of American imperialism in the Philippines and how that connected American interests with the complex diplomacy of East Asia and the Pacific. International competition, military strategy, evangelical religion, and economics. Thank you.